It is pleasure for me to have Ivan Dokmanić today here at TI seminar, and Ivan is currently an associate professor at University of Basel in Switzerland in Department of Mathematics and Computer Science, and previously he was assistant professor in University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and his research interests in different things like inverse problems, machine learning, signal processing. And today we have an exciting topic about learning on graphs and its intersection with statistical mechanics. And I'm curious to hear about universal geometry and what does it mean. So Ivan, please start, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Maxim, for the opportunity to speak here and for the introduction. Yeah, as you said, the talk is really about some core questions in machine learning. Here in my group, the kind of questions that I typically am trying to answer, or that I'm most interested in, are how to combine mechanistic models that come from maybe physics or chemistry or even social sciences with data in an optimal way. So I'm really interested in solving inverse problems using machine learning, say. And that might not be 100% apparent from this talk, but the questions that I'll address in this talk are somehow questions that that inevitably come up when you try to understand combinations of mechanistic models and data. And one observation that kind of I find personally very interesting and fascinating is that we now have this handful of deep learning models, machine learning models that are successful, extremely successful on a whole bunch of tasks, and there's not a whole lot of them. So there's a great universality of these architectures, if you want, but data on the other hand is extremely diverse. In fact, one can say that it's outrageously diverse, much more so than the sort of, at least in my view, somehow the space of machine learning models that we're currently using to treat various sources of data. And just to give an example of the kind of scientific data that one can encounter and had to process, at Flatiron Institute, people are generating terabytes or petabytes of cosmological embodied simulations that then they can try to learn from or make inference. So these are essentially images or 3D images or density type of data. Then there's a totally different kind of data, genomic data, which is something like language or text. There's a finite alphabet, and you construct long sequences of letters, and you have to learn from that as well. Or yet another kind of data is signals that come from interferometers that try to detect gravitational waves. And of course, I only scratch the surface. There's image data, speech data, fMRI, and all of these data types are extremely different. Yet, a handful of machine learning tools are extremely successful at dealing with all of them. And so it's interesting to ask what sort of universal ideas underlie this success, or like what aspects of all of these data types enable success of a small number of machine learning models. And of course, there's any number of answers or attempts at answering this question, but today I'm gonna look at two specific aspects that I believe are very important, that are dear to me. One is geometry, and the other one is emergence of networks. By geometry, I mean that in all of these domains where people are looking at different kinds of data, domain practitioners have a way to define similarity between things. And this similarity immediately yields a sort of a metric geometry. It puts things in some space and organizes them. Even when these things are a priori, when it may not be a priori clear how to properly measure how similar things are, people are very resourceful. And another thing is that sometimes this geometry can become an object of study in itself, a part of the puzzle or a part of the input. This is what we see with the domain of graph learning, where the graph or the network that underlies the data is in fact part of the input. And I'll discuss a little bit about how that emerges. Like one, let's say, straightforward way in which a network or a graph emerges from data is as follows. I mean, if we have some standard data, for example, image data, these are nice paintings, then sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's hard. In this case, it's easy to define a similarity or dissimilarity metric on this data. In this case, we may simply do something like define, some sort of Euclidean distance between pairs of images. And once we do that, we can simply we can simply connect images with an edge, those images whose pairwise distance is smaller than some threshold, so that are close in some sense, that are similar according to our metric. And once you do that, you obtain a graph. Now, this may seem a little bit ad hoc, but it turns out that if your data is really organized in a certain way, there is a certain maybe low-dimensional latent structure that underlies your data, for example, a low-dimensional Riemannian manifold, then this procedure results in a graph that is in some sense equivalent to this manifold. One can see it as a discretization of the manifold, and one can go back and forth. Now, this procedure is very specific because we created the graph from the data. We have a similarity or the dissimilarity metric. We had all our data points very explicitly given, and then we could create this graph. But there are situations when these networks also emerge, just because there are some relations between entities, between objects, and these relations are satisfied for certain pairs of objects and are not satisfied for other pairs of objects. There are numerous examples. One very nice example is the evolutionary tree, the tree of species, or a great diversity of graphs that people in network theory or machine learning graphs encounter, such as transportation networks, collaboration networks. So in a collaboration network, it's not that two people are connected by an edge just because they have some feature vectors, and then somehow these feature vectors are close, and then someone calculated these distances and did some thresholding, but rather simply because they wrote a paper together. So there's a very natural relation. And there are many other examples: protein interaction networks, biological neural networks, and so on. And so the question that motivates my talk is how to, or can we, design representation spaces and machine learning tools for this great diversity of data, having in mind this geometry and network structure that need to be analyzed and learned from. There's another motivation, which is a little bit more pragmatic, which is that the work that I'll present here is very fresh. So fresh, in fact, that we currently don't have any preprints online, but we're supposed to in a couple of days or so. And so I'm trying to use this talk also to motivate myself to finally put the two preprints, which correspond to part 1 and part 2 of the talk, online, because people who actually did the work, two postdocs, Anastasis and Valentin, and Chang, PhD student, would definitely like me to. It's worth mentioning that Anastasis, who is still a postdoc in my lab, is starting a new assistant professor's job at McMaster next week. Actually. There's something in the chat. Should I try and click, or that is okay, just your message. Okay, so let's now dive a little bit into the first part of the talk, which is geometry, or geometry of data. The running question or problem in this part of the talk will be how to represent data. What are good ways to represent very diverse types of data? And we'll be looking for something that we call a good representation space. So we'll be looking for representation spaces that in some sense preserve metric geometry of input data. And the mental picture is that there's some large space, X, with some metric, dx, and maybe we observe a subset, maybe a finite subset of points, of endpoints in this space, and we would like to represent them. You can think of this as being, genomes, images, fMRIs, something, single cell data, whatever. And then I have to say what I mean by a good representation space. So it'll be a bit recursive, but I can actually end recursion. So a good representation space for me is a space such that there exists a good feature map, phi, that approximately preserves distances. So if I calculated the distance between images of 2 points from my input space through phi, then this should be approximately the original distance in X between these 2 points. And I'll have various ways to sort of make this approximate equality more precise during the talk, but the message is simple. And the map phi, what I mean by it being good is that it should be, first of all, it should be an embedding. It should be a continuous injective map. But also it should somehow be amenable to approximation by, let's say, neural networks. So we should be able to implement this map efficiently. Okay, and then another totally plausible question to ask is why would anyone do that? So why not work with data in somehow its original form? And we've already seen some reasons for that. Like a very mundane reason could be that there is simply no good machine learning tools to deal with data in its original form, because the data is very categorical or discrete, or the original space is too big. So we don't have canonical machine learning tools developed, and we need to find a representation of data in a space for which there exist machine learning tools. One such example of this necessity to embed in a nice continuous discrete data in a nice continuous space is this paper I really like, which is about unsupervised learning on protein sequences. So it's an application of large-scale unsupervised learning models that were used to embed language or to calculate representations of language to protein sequences. And this results in a model, in a representation of protein sequences that one can sort of query, in a sense. One can do science with. So it's a tool to do science. And it turns out that once you do this embedding, certain notions from biochemistry, from biology, from evolution, can be obtained as linear projections of these embeddings, this continuous space. Another common reason to represent data in some nice spaces is dimensionality reduction, which one may want to do for exploratory reasons, for visualization reasons, or to compress data. So maybe our endpoint subset of the large metric space has small effective dimension. For example, it comes from a low-dimensional manifold, and so we would like our representation, or maybe more precisely our feature map, to somehow be adaptive, or to be able to adapt to this small effective dimension. Now, people have been doing this for a long time, so this is nothing new. And the default way to do that was to embed data either explicitly or to represent data, I should say, either explicitly or implicitly in some Euclidean spaces, or more generally vector spaces. And what I mean by explicit or implicit is that either there is an objective that uses maybe a norm, Euclidean norm, so that the resulting representations are Euclidean, or somehow it's implicit in that we're using this data in some downstream tasks that have some Euclidean assumptions. To make this more concrete, Luke Hebig is a student who last year, I think, took a graph learning course with me. He works on problems in neuroscience. And so he gave me this data set, or actually he produced these images that show calcium imaging data. So for neurons in the brain of a mouse that performs some task. I'm not sure exactly why. And he's interested in studying the head orientation of this mouse. So the head orientation is an angle, right? But the input is this sort of messy time series from 42 neurons. Okay, and so one way to go about this task is to say, well, okay, let me try to now do some sort of dimensionality reduction. Let me try to maybe embed this data in some low-dimensional space where things will be clearer. Some properties will become clearer. And one way to do that is to use, for example, Laplacian eigenmaps, which is a manifold learning algorithm, a very classical one. Now, we would begin by defining similarity between the different data points. So data points here are simply time snapshots. So vectors that there's 56 neurons. So these are 56-dimensional vectors. We can use Euclidean distance, and then we can define similarity as some sort of a decreasing function of Euclidean distance. So these Wij's are affinities between points that become smaller as the points get further and further apart. And now, we can try to use those similarities to compute low-dimensional embeddings. And if you use Laplacian eigenmaps, then the way this typically goes is that you construct a neighborhood graph, and then you compute the graph Laplacian, and then you do the eigen decomposition, and then you take the eigenvectors as your coordinates. But I'm not going to write that here, because implicitly what you're doing when you calculate Laplacian eigenmaps is that you minimize a certain objective that looks something like this. and maybe missing some normalization factors, but this is not so important here. So the objective that you're trying to minimize involves similarity that's specified by practitioners, by the main specialists between points, Wij, and this weighs the distance between the representations of the point I, xi, and of the point xj that are called yi and yj. And now it turns out that, I mean, how do you make this small? Well, the way to make this small is that this distance is small when Wij is large. So which means that for very similar points, you'll get similar embeddings that are close together. But of course, the distance that we're using here is the L2 distance, in this case, just on the plane. And so this is a very explicit way in which these Laplacian eigenmaps endow the learning problem with Euclidean geometry. Of course, you can calculate this embedding for this data set and get a circle, which is the right thing to do. So you can show that this correlation, you can actually decode the head orientation of the mouse. A way this Euclidean assumption comes up implicitly is that maybe you have a deep neural network and you don't really care what kind of representations are inside. You never put any particular norms, but maybe you put a classifier after the network, or you do something on the latent space, and this downstream processing has some notion of vectors or distances, maybe k-nearest neighbors or some next margin stuff. And then again, implicitly, you have this, you're making a Euclidean assumption, right? Okay, and so the question is this always the right choice? Is it, or are we somehow, I mean, it seems to work well in a lot of examples, but are there interesting examples where this is actually not the right choice? And it turns out there are. So the past couple of years, in metric geometry, this has been known for a while, and in machine learning, it's hot stuff maybe since 5-6 years ago. So it turns out that trees, let's say regular trees with a constant branching factor, you cannot embed them in a fixed dimension Euclidean space, no matter how large the dimension, without incurring a large distortion. And this is bad news because in data science, there's a lot of hierarchical data. So, almost anything you can name is hierarchical. And if you're trying to embed these things in Euclidean spaces, you'll inevitably introduce distortion. And if somehow, this affects your classification performance or scientific conclusions, that this is a bad thing. But there's also good news. The good news is that that trees can be embedded in very low dimensional hyperbolic space with small distortion. And so somehow problem solved, or so at least so it seems, right? So you can just use hyperbolic spaces and you don't need to distort the trees. Now, this observation has spurred a great deal of very intense work in machine learning, deep learning, all over the place. People have come up with a whole bunch of machine learning tools to work in hyperbolic spaces. So hyperbolic dimensionality reduction, hyperbolic classification, deep neural networks in hyperbolic spaces, graph neural nets in hyperbolic spaces, and so on, all sorts of things. And the reason hyperbolic spaces can embed trees is that somehow they look a little bit like trees. So there are many models of 2D hyperbolic space. One possible model is the so-called Poincaré model, which is just a unit disk endowed with a certain metric. And so the metric on this unit disk is such that the distances of points that are close to the boundary is much larger than the distance between points that are close to the center. So these curved lines show the geodesics, right? And so somehow it's like one of these Escher paintings that you must have seen. So what happens is that if you want to embed a tree here, the rim of the disk, there's a lot of space there. So you can put, your tree has a constant branching factor, so the number of nodes at any given level grows exponentially with the level, but it doesn't matter because also the volume of hyperbolic space grows exponentially as you move away from the origin. And that's good to say, have a lot of space. And this then yields good performance also on many downstream tasks. There are other models of hyperbolic space, so this is maybe not so central. But what is interesting is that, of course, hyperbolic space has constant negative curvature. There are spaces with positive curvature, or this is a space with a constant positive curvature sphere. There are types of data that are cyclic, and for those cyclic types of data, again, you cannot embed them in Euclidean space without, some lower bound, large distortion. But you can, of course, embed them on a circle or on a sphere. Okay, so that's another, line of work that one can pursue if one believes that there's some circular cyclic geometry in the data. And then moving forward, people have started combining all of these spaces. So they said, well, maybe my data is a little bit like a tree, but actually it's not just a tree. It's more complicated. So I'll try to embed it in a product of maybe Euclidean space and hyperbolic space, or hyperbolic space of some dimension, and spherical space and Euclidean space. And so you can take any number of combinations here that you like. And so this is an example of a product of hyperbolic space and Euclidean. A line, and I'm on the hyperbola. This is a cylinder, which is a sphere times a Euclidean space. And the way to visualize this at the level of data is maybe that your data structure, implicitly maybe you know that, is structured as a ring of trees. So then it's kind of intuitive that if it's structured as a ring of trees, then a product of a spherical space and a hyperbolic space might be the way to go. Once you start doing these things, you lose a lot of comfortable, familiar properties that we're used to in Euclidean spaces, like global parameterization, vector space structure. What does it mean? You cannot really just add points now in this new space, or at least not easily. And so one really needs to develop new tools. But the question is now, is really the best way to go about embedding structured data or representing structured data to sort of take these products, to stick to constant curvature spaces like hyperbolic and spherical and Euclidean, and then take products of these spaces. And then it also requires you to know a lot about your data up front, because how are you supposed to choose which spaces you product? So there's some, a little bit of clunkiness about it. And so it's fair to ask, whether there are representation spaces that are nice or good in a way that I defined at the beginning of the talk, that work for very, very diverse input spaces that we want to represent. So definitely including trees and hierarchical spaces, but potentially much more. So in order to answer this question, it's useful to think a little bit about what causes problems. So when things fail, so which spaces are not these universal spaces. And here by universal, I have to say that I'm kind of more tolerant than pure mathematicians who study metric geometry are. So here I'm somehow, hand-wavingly talking about universality in a machine learning sense. Okay, but I'll also make precise statements, right? But they're going to be less strict than what some geometries would do. Okay, so of course, if hyperbolic spaces that are negatively curved, so they generate their volume grows fast. If they're good for embedding trees, maybe we just have to find a manifold that has the right curvature for our data. And this has been tried. I should put some more references than I have here. But it turns out that if you take any, for example, Riemannian manifold, so it is something we can prove, that has bounded negative sectional curvature, you can find a point set that embeds with large distortion. So for which you need to sort of distort distances quite a bit by a factor that depends on the number of points in the set. And the same holds for any compact Riemannian manifold. So these are results that can be derived easily from known results. So some of the obstruction of finite low-dimensional manifolds is that they are too small, even if they're negatively curved. The second natural idea then is to go from finite dimensional spaces to infinite dimensional spaces. Now that's a good idea, except that it doesn't work alone. That has been known for a while. So famous result over again says that, this is funny phrasing, but for n large n, there's an endpoint metric space that you cannot by Lipschitz embed in this Hilbert space, L2, space of square integral functions on the real line, with distortion that's smaller than something that grows with n as well, logarithmic. And so it turns out that the obstruction of at least Hilbert spaces is that they're too flat. And what you need in order to succeed seems to be a combination. Well, if the combination of these two things doesn't work, then we're in trouble. Right? So now for the positive results. Okay, it turns out that it seems that a good way to proceed is to do something that may seem very adventurous if you haven't seen this idea before, which is to instead of representing your data points as vectors, maybe in some vector space or as functions or whatever, you actually represent your data points as probability distributions. Maybe a good mental image, not 100% accurate, but useful, is that instead of having deterministic embeddings, now you somehow randomize your embedding. You say, I'm going to represent my deterministic data points by some random objects. Not quite, but maybe it's a good mental image. Essentially, it's probability distributions. And this seems to work. Actually, we know that it works in a certain sense, right? So it turns out that if you take the space of probability distributions over some low dimension space, R3, we currently don't know what happens for R1 or R2, but in R3, Andoni and Neyman proved that if you endow this space with the Wasserstein 2 metric, then actually, for any Wasserstein P metric, I don't know why I put 2 here, you can by Holder embed any finite metric space, no matter how large, with arbitrarily low distortion. It's quite amazing. Okay, so this means that you don't have to, yes, you have to go to probability distributions, but still you can work with probability distributions over a relatively low dimensional space. Now, the price that you have to pay, which may or may not be important depending on what you're trying to do, is that you have to replace by ellipses by Holder. And what it means is that you have to slightly distort the metric by taking a certain power of it. And effectively what this means is that the distances of very close points have to become larger and the distances between faraway points have to become smaller. So somehow shortest paths in this new space have to be fractal. And that's why this type of embeddings are often called snowflake embeddings or snowflake spaces. And now we know that this space of probability measures endowed by the Wasserstein metric exhibits positive curvature of various magnitudes on all scales everywhere. So it's a good candidate. And it's of course an infinite dimensional space. Now we don't want to work with this because it's not necessarily easy to parameterize to efficiently parameterize objects in this space of that has the Wasserstein 2 metric. We want to have objects that we can somehow parameterize by neural networks, for example, that we can learn for. Another thing that we would like to do is we would like to work over the real line instead of over R3, because it's very easy to compute these optimal transport theoretic distances over R, near trivial. And the third desideratum that we have is that we would like our embedding map, so the resulting embedding map or representation feature map, to be efficiently approximable or implementable by some way we know to approximate functions. So of course, for example, by a neural network. Now, we're not the first ones to notice by and large that these results in math exist and that one can use embeddings into spaces of probability distributions to potentially, do better on a whole bunch of machine learning tasks. So there is a small but growing number of works that try to develop machine learning tools that work in probability spaces. And here are just some, here's a boutique selection. So you can do geodesic PCA in Wasserstein space, in Wasserstein 2. You can do clustering. There are papers that do regression. These are all rigorous papers that develop machine learning tools for, when the downstream tasks operate on probability measures. Okay. Now, having in mind our 3 desiderata, the embeddings that we will be looking for, this is our proposal, is to use as representation space this transport theoretic space of Gaussian mixtures that was proposed by Delon and Desolneux in 2020. And what this space is very similar to the general space of probability measures endowed by the Wasserstein metric, except that here we restrict our attention to probability distributions that are Gaussian mixtures with finite but arbitrarily large number of mixture components, where the couplings in the calculation of optimal transport are also constrained to be Gaussian mixtures. So the coupling distribution, the joint distribution, the coupling is constrained to be a Gaussian mixture. And what this gives practically, for example, over the plane is that, you can, so this is also a complete geodesic space. So you can talk about shortest paths, you can talk about geodesics. So let's say that you have some starting distribution. This is taken from the Delon and Desolneux paper, and some target distribution. You want to connect them by geodesic. So this connection via geodesic in mixed Wasserstein space of mixtures. So at all points along the geodesic, you have a Gaussian mixture, whereas in the standard Wasserstein space, you don't. So you get more general distributions. The endpoints are the same. Okay. And so the way we want to do that is we want to be able to do out of sample representations. So we don't want to just embed some finite points, but we actually want to be able to do out-of-sample distribution. So we want to train a function that can do these embeddings fast. We don't want to do something like have to calculate a new Laplacian eigenmaps embedding every time we get a new point. We want to approximate a representation map or a feature map and then use it once and for all the data that comes from this space or this distribution. And so what we show in the paper, you know, they will put online, let's say next week, you can pester me, you can ask for it, you should, is that this can be achieved by something that we call a probabilistic transformer. This is actually an architecture that we proposed in a recent paper of ours, where we talk about universal approximation under exact constraints. So we showed that this architecture in particular can achieve that. This is at Spotlight at ICLR 2022. But here we use it for a different purpose. So the reason we call it a probabilistic transformer is that there are two attention layers. The first one that I'm not showing here, and I should, is somehow a standard attention layer. And the second one is what we call a probabilistic attention layer, right? So we use a certain deep neural network to calculate parameters of these mixture components of the distributions of the Gaussian mixture that we want to parameterize. And then we use these parameters to actually construct an object that is now a probability measure. In fact, a Gaussian mixture model. Right? So then we want to learn the parameters of this MLP such that the parameters it outputs from a certain embedding of these points using distances yield representations in this mixed Wasserstein space such that the distance between representations faithfully represents the distance between the original points, whatever it was. So that's the idea. And we can, in fact, prove some things about it, which are, I would say, quite original, or at least quite new. This intersection of metric geometry and machine learning, deep learning representation theory. So the kind of results that we can prove is, for example, given any metric space, there is a probabilistic transformer of the architecture that I flashed it to you on the previous slide, with quite tame dimensions, right? So it has a nice width, a nice depth. So I'll tell you what M is in this story, and a nice effective dimension. Oh, maybe I should specify what effective dimension is. So by effective dimension, I mean essentially the number of mixture components that this architecture, that's a parameter, right? And so we have to somehow decide what this is. So the effective dimension is something that's log n, such that we can, in some probabilistic sense, embed any endpoint subset of this metric space with distortion that is of the order log n. So it turns out that no matter what this input metric space is, there is a probabilistic transform. If I construct a probabilistic transform of a certain dimension, then I can guarantee that endpoints from any endpoints, okay, any but fixed endpoints from this metric space can be embedded with a guarantee. So the way to think about this is maybe a little bit abstract, but the way to think about it is that this is really a sort of a universal approximation type theorem for representations, okay, for representations of finite metric spaces, right? And because it's representations of finite metric spaces, this end plays a role. It turns out that if you know this bi-Lipschitzness here is relaxed to biholder, so snowflake type embeddings, then in fact we can, you know, we don't need to do this in some probabilistic sense. We can do this deterministically. And another thing that it turns out is, so this result holds for very general metric spaces. So these things can be wild beasts. They can be really, really ugly. But normally data in machine learning, it does not come from this kind of worst case, completely crazy metric spaces. Data comes from structured spaces. So if your input space is in some sense structured, for instance, it's a Riemannian manifold, or it's a tree, or it's, you know, certain nice graph, then the effective dimension, the number of mixture components that you need, we can prove that it's actually equal. For example, if the data comes from a Riemannian manifold, it's roughly equal to the manifold dimension. So it's independent of this number of points. It doesn't anymore scale, which is somehow a pleasing result, right? Because you don't want it to scale if you know that there's some latent geometry behind your data. And the good thing about it is that, you know, it's a fairly standard neural network. So we can actually implement it, which is what we did. And so here I'll just show some, let's say, initial numerical demonstrations that show that this works well or nicely on synthetic data. Here's an example of a tree. So we know that these kind of trees cannot be nicely embedded in Euclidean spaces. And we compute embeddings of this tree. And so what this plot shows here, so each shade of between green and yellow is a Gaussian mixture output by our model, by a probabilistic transformer that represents one point along this path that connects to boundary points. Okay, and so there's color coding, and you can see that somehow these Gaussian mixtures continuously transform from the one that represents this point to the one that represents this point on the other side. You can do something similar for a completely different space with completely different qualitative characteristics, positive curvature, the sphere. And so this is somehow an attempt to illustrate embeddings for various points of the sphere that are shown here. So all of these embeddings are in fact univariate Gaussian mixtures, and you can see that they kind of nicely vary around the sphere and in other dimensions. Quantitatively, what is interesting is precisely to characterize this sort of out of sample performance. So we use some training set, which is a finite subset of a metric space to embed, but then we actually want to apply this map. And we have guarantees for the finite number of points, but we would like to somehow, at least empirically, show that it also works for any other points from this ambient metric space. And it turns out that this is true. So the abscissa here essentially shows the number of points, and the train loss is the loss for which we have guarantees. So that's the loss, that's the kind of embedding or representation loss or distortion for those points that are used to train or that figure in the theorem. But you can see that for a random subset of other points from this random graph, actually the distortion also goes down. And another interesting thing is that, for example, if you try to embed data from n-dimensional spheres and you make n larger and larger, so you're looking at spheres in higher and higher and higher dimension, then one can try to compare the performance of Euclidean embeddings and Gaussian mixture embeddings computed by probabilistic transformers that have the same number of parameters. So such that the representations are parameterized by this, let's say, same number of real scalars. And you can see that as the dimension of the sphere grows, I think this is somehow 10 Gaussian mixtures, and maybe R20 here, I should check. But the distortion of probabilistic embeddings is more or less constant, while for Euclidean embeddings, after a certain critical dimension, it explodes exponentially. Okay, so that's it for the first part, and now I'd like to move to, and maybe I'll have to be quite fast, or maybe not, to discuss how these considerations, these geometric considerations, can actually be, in some sense, how they can, in some sense, represent data that is an input to our machine learning algorithm. So this is what I call statistics of learning of graphs, because here in this part of the talk, I'll be actually interested in statistical and generalization properties. The first part can be seen as approximation guarantees for some embeddings of finite metric spaces, and here I'll talk about statistics. Okay, so what do I mean by this sort of lofty statement that the geometry or the domain should become part of the input data or a first order citizen? I showed you this example where we had some images, and then we constructed some, according to some similarity metric or measure, we constructed a neighborhood graph. Okay, now it turns out that you can actually separate this, right? You can say, well, this graph is now the domain, and the data points, there are some data points that are supported on the domain. And I'm using this because I have nice pictures, but in other examples that I've shown you, the graph sort of was created by some mechanism that did not include calculating similarities, thresholding similarities, and then making graph. Graphs was just created based on some relational information about your data points. Okay, so in some sense, we now think that there is some latent mechanism that governs the phenomenon that we're interested in. And this phenomenon generates the graph. It generates the data on the graph. Of course, we believe that there's some correlation between the two, but there could be very little correlation. And we don't know what kind of correlation it is. It doesn't have to be this similarity notion. So this is what I want to discuss here. And of course, now we know that when we're looking at the data on graphs and processing them in a way that depends on the graph, then probably the best hypothesis classes or functions that we have to do that are graph neural metrics. So I'll be looking at certain graph neural metrics and try to understand their generalization performance. Kind of metrics in particular that I'll be looking at are convolutional So I believe that many of you already know what graph convolutional networks are. I'll just do a very brief introduction here, because the exact functional form is not so important. I'll give high-level results. But graph convolutional networks can be seen as sweeping generalizations of convolutional networks over images, let's say. So imagine that your data lives on some graph that is specified by a set of nodes, here 6 of them, and a set of links, some number of them. Then the geometry or the topology or the connectivity of this graph can be represented by an adjacency matrix. So this is just a matrix, a 6 by 6 matrix in this case, that has a 1 for every pair of nodes that's connected by a link, by an edge. And now we imagine that to every node of this graph, there's we associate an attribute or a feature vector. This feature vector could be an image, like in the previous example, but more often it's in computational chemistry, it's some properties of atoms. In social networks, it's some properties of people, if you want. In citation networks, it's some properties of authors, and so on and so forth. And so we have a vector of features. For the ith node, this vector is xi, and then we update this vector of features in a way that resembles a convolutional network. So in particular, we update it by taking a weighted combination. I'm using this notation that I did not define for. So nodes j here are neighbors of the node I. So I do a weighted combination of all neighbors of this node x, and the weights are given in some weight matrix W. Okay, and I do the same. I'm doing the same weighted combination. So I'm using the same matrix W, essentially for all the nodes. So it's a convolutional network because in some sense I'm doing the same thing everywhere on the graph. And a very short way that we typically start with to write this down is by using the adjacency matrix. So I can write this down as I'm updating a feature matrix corresponding, that collects feature vectors for all the nodes on the graph. And so if I write this out at once for all the nodes, then it looks like this. I apply some activation function on linearity to then I use the adjacency matrix, and then the features on the graph, and then my weight matrix. I could have the different weight matrix for every layer. So this kind of L counts layers or iterations for the graph neural net. And it's a fairly simple architecture that works extremely well in certain cases, not so well in other cases, but it's one of the staple architectures in graph learning. Okay. And the input data, this is very important to note, is A is not just some fixed thing. A is actually part of our input. Right? So the function, this graph function, should be seen as a function of A and X. Now, our goal here is to get very precise results. And so in order to get precise results, I have to simplify things a bit. So this is going to be my next step. But before I do that, I just quickly go over the kind of theoretical guarantees that are currently known for graph neural networks. It turns out, and maybe I'm being unfair, but I mean, most of the guarantees are actually on the various approximation properties. What kind of functions can you approximate? What kind of invariant or equivariant functions you can approximate using graph neural networks? And there, people are interested in comparing the sort of expressive power of graph neural networks to something that is called the Weiss-Feiler-Lemon test. That's known from a while ago. That it's kind of has to do with graph isomorphisms and distinguishing graphs. But there's much less work on statistical properties of graph neural networks. So the question of, once I train a graph neural network, can I expect it to generalize well? Or rather, why? Why does it generalize well? Because usually it does. Right? So there are some empirical studies, and then there's a bunch of papers that try to calculate bounds from classical statistical learning theories. So they try to calculate, or they put forward bounds that are based on Vapnik-Chervonenkis dimension, or that are based on Rademacher complexity. And it turns out that these tools somehow are a little bit rough to deal with graph neural networks, where actually there is a certain correlation between the domain and the data, and this has to be taken into account explicitly, right? So usually bounds based on VC dimension or Rademacher complexity are quite loose when you look at the actual networks. And there are a few works that try to move beyond and that explicitly look at this correlation between the domain and the features on the graph. And the reason why I keep hammering this on this correlation between the graph between A and X is that A when I was designing the graph based on some similarity metric, then A was encoding the similarity relation, right? So we had the one where every pair of nodes is similar. But in real graphs, links can signify extremely different things. And one way to see that is, you know, you can have something that's like a friendship graph, right? Where if you and me have, you know, a common friend, well, if two people have a common friend, then it's likely that they're also friends. Right? So there's this sort of transitive relation, and links signify similarity. Whereas if you think about graphs that, for example, encode protein-protein interaction networks, links signify something totally different. Right? Because if I have a protein A that interacts with protein B, and then A undergoes a very tiny mutation, so now I have A and A prime, then this tiny mutation of A is not likely to interact with A. It's again likely to interact with this other protein B, right? So we have this sort of bipartite or k-partite structure, right? In the end, what we get is that in friendship graphs, we have triangles, a lot of triangles. But in interaction graphs, like protein-protein interaction networks, then we have a lot of rectangles. And graphs signify dissimilarity. You know, like proteins belong to different camps. And I mean, it's not surprising that when you run GCNs and these types of graphs, you get totally different performance. And people are wondering why. I mean, they understand why at a high level, but everyone, many people, but there is no theory that explains it. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll simplify things quite a bit and look at linear graph neural networks. Now, linear is a misnomer, and I'll explain why in a second. But we'll look at graph neural networks that are essentially multi-channel graph convolutional filters. That's one thing. And, you know, this is work showing that this type of networks actually perform extremely well for reasons that are still not fully understood. And why do I say that linear is a misnomer? Because usually when people study neural networks and then they remove activation functions, they really get a linear end-to-end function, non-linearly parametrized. But what we have in this case is that the input is both A and X, and we have a product of them, right? So even without activation functions, this is actually a bilinear object in the input. It's not linear, right? Even though it has this linear field, okay? Because A is a first order space. And we want to train this to do some sort of classification. So we have some labels for the nodes, and we'll somewhat unusually use the least squares laws because you can calculate with this to do binary classification. We'll have some regularization on the weights of this neural network, and we will look for the weights that give us the smallest training loss. Another important ingredient of our approach, and I'll try to speed it up because I see that nearing the 50-minute mark, is that in order to give precise bounds, we have to make some assumptions on how the graph is correlated with the data. Okay, so we have to come up with some sort of a nice analytic parameterized graph generative model mechanism that allows us to calculate. And we don't have to invent one because there exists very good things in the literature. And we'll use something that's called the contextual stochastic block model. Now, to understand what a contextual stochastic block model is, we start with an ordinary stochastic block model. Stochastic block model is simply a graph, a random graph, in which you have two communities, and the probability and links are formed between nodes at random, and the probability that links form between communities is different from the probability that links form within communities. Okay, and so, you know, yn and ym are labels, so we have communities corresponding to labels +1 and -1. So if two nodes have the same label, then they have some probability of connecting, otherwise they have some other probability of connecting. And the nice way to parameterize these two probabilities is with respect to the average degree, by using a parameter lambda. Okay, so if parameter lambda is positive, then we have higher probability that nodes within the same community connect, and we get something that's called homophilic graphs, like friendship graphs, right, where similar things connect. If lambda is negative, we get heterophilic graphs, like protein interaction graphs, okay? Because then links in different nodes in different communities connect with higher probability. Okay, and why contextual? Well, stochastic block model has been studied for a long time, in like, you know, it's really like community detection, bread and butter. But contextuality comes from the fact that we now have features. Okay, so now we have feature vectors that are associated to every node that are also random Gaussian features. And those features can be noisy. Okay, and this level of feature noise determines the performance of the graph neural network. So we have some random features that are correlated with the labels that are associated to every to every node. Okay, and so it turns out that there's, this CSBM defines some knobs that we can tweak, and we can try to calculate generalization error based on how these knobs are tuned. Okay? And the knobs are lambda. If lambda is 0, you get the Erdős-Rényi graph. Everything connects with the same probability. There's no information in the graph. You can just throw it away, right? So lambda is sort of a graph SNR. Mu is node feature SNR, so that's another parameter. Then we look at this regime where we look at very large graphs, potentially scaling, to infinity. But the number of features, the ratio of the number of features and the graph size is kept fixed, right? So this is something that we fix. And then it's a semi-supervised scenario. So we don't train on the entire graph. Then there's nothing to test on, right? So we actually see a subset of nodes on the graph that we can use to train in a transductive way, and then we can test on the other nodes. And the ratio between the nodes that we use to train and test is tau, and then there's some regularization. Okay, I'll hurry up a bit. So there's a whole bunch of formidable technical difficulties in trying to calculate now with this model, and I'll just very briefly go over this because I cannot really go into details. It turns out that you can express optimal, because this is a convex problem, you can express optimal weights in closed form. Okay, this matrix SOBS here is just the matrix that selects the nodes that we have for training. Okay, so it's some selection matrix. And we can calculate these optimal weights in closed form. And now what we want to understand is behavior of this object. Okay, so we want to calculate risk. But to do so, we have to reason about a product of correlated structure random matrices, right? So all over the place, we have these kind of products, and we want to understand the spectrum and the behavior of these kind of products of random matrices, where A in particular is some sort of a binary random matrix, right? And this is hard. Right? There are not many results in the literature that would actually enable us to do that. So the way we move forward is we sort of develop what I think is an original mix of random matrix theory and methods from statistical physics. So our results are, at least part of our results, our main results are not rigorous because they rely on the replica method, which is known from statistical physics, right, which achieved tremendous success, has been used to characterize spin glasses, phase resistance in spin glasses, and a whole bunch of other problems. George Parisi won the Nobel Prize in part for his work on the replica method last year. So this is, in some sense, a well-tested method, but still mathematically not rigorous. And just to give you a flavor of the kind of results that we develop in order to finally solve the problem is we're ultimately interested in understanding generalization. So we want to know the test risk. This is the quantity that we want to compute. So we want to know how we perform on the nodes. How do we label nodes that come from the test set that we did not see during our transactive training? Okay. And as I mentioned, one difficulty is, for example, in the fact that the matrix A is binary. Okay, so calculating with this matrix, doing random matrix theory with this matrix is hard. So what we can show non-rigorously is that we can, in fact, replace this matrix by some basically random Gaussian matrix from Gaussian orthogonal ensemble that has similar statistics, and that the test risk is going to be the same for this original matrix and our new matrix that is much easier to calculate with, for which there are analytical results in the literature. Okay, and I cannot really now, I don't have time to explain how we do it, but this particular part is inspired by the original CSBM paper that does this for some other purpose. Okay, and what we can get by doing that is we can get explicit formulas. Right? This is totally unlike anything that currently exists in the literature. I mean, it's miles away from it because the only thing that currently exists in the literature are bounds that are based on VC dimension or Rademacher complexity or similar things, right? And these bounds are very crude. They don't really reveal any particular phenomena. And I'll show you that this does, right? So what we get are exact formulas for the train and test risk. Okay. This is in the no regularization limit because otherwise these formulas become too ugly. But in this case, they're actually even presentable on a slide. Okay. And one thing that we can now, by plotting these formulas, that we can see is that if you look at things the right way, you can observe double descent. So if you know about double descent, then great. If you never heard about it, it's an emergent phenomenon that is sort of a generalization of the standard bias variance trade-off. And essentially, if you look at the risk curve as a function of some complexity parameter, the risk curve will not go down and then up, like in the standard bias variance trade-off, but it'll descend again. So there's the second descent, so the phenomenon is called double descent. You can see it clearly, for example, here. And this existence of double descent has been disputed in graph neural nets for a long time. This is actually the first time we observe it. And we observe it on the basis of a formula, but then we can go to real networks of different kinds and real graph, big, real production level graph neural nets on real data sets. And we can see similar things there. We can see it's not as prominent, but we can see double descent. Another thing, and I'll really try to hurry up and wrap it up now, is that we can clearly observe the difference in the behavior of homophilic and heterophilic graphs. Yeah, in order to keep everything within the hour, I think I'll just move ahead, but I'll be happy to discuss this online or offline, or point you to our paper once it's offline, probably next week. Okay, and to wrap up, I think this sort of attempts to find universal reasons why things work are always, one could and probably should always be cynical about them. So this is the best way I could structure the talk. But if you're cynical about the universality claims of anything, I almost agree with you. So we know that there's no free lunch, there's no silver bullets. You cannot really do. Once the method becomes too universal, it probably becomes useless. Nevertheless, in machine learning, we've seen a whole bunch of near silver bullets over time, and I know something that comes to mind are kernel methods that work across a great diversity of objects. And so I think my feeling is that this sort of doing machine learning in probability space is one of these near universal or near silver bullets, right? That will have an impact. Right? So I think it's a very interesting and practically relevant direction to look into. And another thing is, if you talk to people who work on metric embedding theory, they're, now I will not gasp at our results, but the machine learning community, I think, should be interested in them because it's really a different way to combine, or a new way to combine ideas from representational learning, metric embedding theory, and deep learning. Right? So we get these approximation guarantees for these maps. Most of the results in metric embedding theory are existence results, but we actually construct maps that compute these embeddings, and we show why they're good. Which I think is interesting. We can actually train these networks and done it. And finally, I think to understand, to really precisely understand and develop good theory for emergent machine learning algorithms, we'll at some point have to depart from very, very classical tools like VC dimensions or random high complexity. They're good tools. They give good, rules of thumb potentially, but they're very far from being precise. So I think, the sort of the hunt is open for better complexity measures, and people have been doing this for a long time. So we don't try to do that here. We try to do a precise calculation, but the reason is that these old tools are simply not sharp anymore, not sharp enough. And with that, I'd like to thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ivan. And it's a very extremely interesting talk. And for me, like I worked a bit on representation learning, and I was very interested in results on statistical properties of graph neural networks, because indeed in the literature, people are so focused on Weiss failure-Lehman test and on different generalizations of it and how graph neural networks are related to that. So these statistical results are like very awaited, but your type of results, it's a bit unusual, I would say. So it's very interesting and inspiring, I would say. So let us go through the questions. So I have a question questions from Charles. He has questions on graph signal processing. So the first question is, when dealing with signals met in graph signal processing problems, what type of space do we deal with if it's not Euclidean?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I think one needs to distinguish between two properties of these underlying spaces, right? One is the properties of the graph, and we can forget about the data. And then there's the properties of the kind of node features that live on the graph, that live on nodes. So those node features could be, for instance, images. And then within images, images live on a grid. We can do convolutions on images and all these things. So images, as an interesting data type, we can think of them as being Euclidean. But here I'm talking about things at the level of data sets. So we can have a data set, a particular data set of images, a particular subset of the space of all possible images, whose organization is very non-Euclidean. And what I'm saying is that that taking this into account, helps do better processing. So very concretely, often in graph signal processing, graphs encode actually similarity, right? So when we think about a low-pass filter on a graph, this means that this low-pass filter is literally like a Gaussian that lives on a graph. And oftentimes people will show, they'll run diffusion on graphs, or they will plot over the graph the eigenvectors of the graph Laplacian, and then you see that, low-pass filters really signify things that don't change a lot from node to node. So in this framework, I think maybe it's a little bit like saying that that if nodes have to connect things that have different labels, then the label function has a high frequency, right? So that's maybe the best connection I can make to graph signal processing, right? So this means that I cannot use small index eigenfunctions, eigenvectors of the graph Laplacian. I actually have to look at the whole spectrum, or at least at the high end of the spectrum, right, for the graph Laplacian. You see what I mean? It's like, because the only way I could create an oscillatory label, which I have to do on a heterophilic graph, is by going there. Yeah. So a bit of a meandering answer, but I hope it somehow correlates with the question.
Okay, and I think the second question from Charles, he continues saying, more generally, can we extend the part one to signal processing and say that graph signal processing is a universal form of signal processing?
I mean, I think this is not too outrageous. I would say that graphs are extremely versatile, and oftentimes even when you want to, there's a lot of people, for example, are trying to do signal processing on Riemannian manifolds, and you can define, there's a differentiable structure, you can do a lot of interesting things, but in practice, it's often more efficient and easier, and it works better if you discretize the manifold into a graph and run a graph neural net. And one example, I know examples on signal processing on spheres that corroborate this claim. So somehow graphs are a good representation of a whole bunch of objects. Of course, there are different things like simplicity of complexes, more, things that encode higher order relations that graphs cannot do. Graphs can only do pairwise things, right? So if you want to look for even more general objects, then hypergraphs, simplicity of complexes, and these topological things are maybe the way to go.
Okay, thank you. So I have a couple of questions myself. So first of all, this result on probabilistic embeddings and the improved properties when you consider probabilistic embeddings is very nice. But from practical point of view, so how do you use this probabilistic embeddings at the end? So usually people consider embeddings because then you can then it's just simpler to do some machine learning with embeddings, right? So that's one of the main motivations. And for probabilistic embeddings, so how do you use them after that? So I'm just not aware of the literature.
Okay. Yeah, I understand the question. Yeah, so that is the whole point. We don't have a lot of downstream tools, but I put too few references. I should put more. But how can I do this? So I can maybe go to this quite sparse slide, although there is much more. Right? So here are a couple of tools. Here are a couple of tools that exist already now. So what you would like to have is the entire machine learning machinery that we have for dealing with Euclidean stuff in some spaces of probability measures. Right? Some exist, and I've seen. I know actually of quite a few more, so I can point you to them. But yeah, you can do PCA. Or sort of what is called geodesic PCA, right? So where instead of subspaces, you look at somehow geodesics, right? And you can do clustering, you can do regression over probability measures. These things already exist. And I think it's interesting to work on extending this arsenal.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's just a new concept for me, and it sounds very interesting. Indeed. Yeah. Regarding the second part, let me think. I had some question just disappeared. So Okay, so there is, yeah, as I said, that statistical results were relatively rare. I think I was not following too closely, but what I was expecting is that people start to do some kind of results that they assume a certain generative model for graph. So you have some generative model for features and for graph on top, and then to prove some classical statistical rates. I don't know, parametric or non-parametric rates depending on the kind of a model you have. Are you aware of results of this type? Because for your model, you get something very special. I'm not sure that I fully catched why you obtain this very special explicit risks, but like generally speaking, are these types of results, do these types of results exist, or?
Yeah. First of all, I understand that probably this part was not very easy. It's the first time I'm talking about this stuff, so chances are presentation can be optimized. But yeah, they do exist. I mean, in standard, for example, least squares regression, of course, you need. I mean, the only way we can currently do it is to randomize something, right? So we need, random covariates, and these things have been. I mean, this sort of precise characterizations are now available for many interesting regression problems. For example, for least squares, or for random features, least squares with random features for this type of models from the group of Andrea Montanari. Or they exist. I mean, different techniques. They exist for lasso or for this kind of M estimator types with random Gaussian designs. So these are results from the Samit Al-Mak and the group of Abaka Sibi. They're based on Gaussian comparison lemmas, so they can again get precise generalization or risk bounds. I mean, one can interpret these objects as such, right? So they exist, but you have to make strong assumptions, right? And so we do make a strong assumption here. I mean, we make an assumption that the graph comes from a relatively simple random generative model, right? And in reality, I mean, the graphs are much more complex. But it turns out that at least qualitatively, we can observe that the phenomena that our formulas demonstrate also take place in real networks. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, in graph neural nets, okay. So a very quick comment. When I go to the slide where I had some literature. Yeah. So these three papers, Desser et al., Varanol et al., and Loop, they're closer to what we're doing. In particular, Desser et al., they work with Rademacher complexity. They get pretty good bounds, much better than VC based bounds, and they specifically look at the transductive learning, so not inductive. And then they specialize their bounds to the stochastic block model. They don't call it the contextual, but essentially what they do is a contextual stochastic block model. Right? They still get bounds, not precise results, because they use Rademacher complexity, but it's in the right direction. I think it's a good result.
I mean, being a statistician, I'm fine with bounds, Okay, of course, nice to have precise results, but usually you can't. So
yeah, like, the thing is that somehow bounds don't let you bounds are definitely good, right? Because they're very general. You don't have to make very specific assumptions. But on the other hand, you don't see this phenomenon like double descent because it's just smoothed out. I mean, it's way below the bound somehow. So
yeah. Okay, depends on the bound, of course, but yeah, sure. If the bound is loose in some regimes, that of course you lose. Okay, can you send the presentation so that we distribute it internally? So I think the video will be available later, but for the presentation, can you send me it and so that we distribute it internally?
Sure, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah. Okay. So. Okay, I actually don't see more questions, but I think that we already had a nice discussion, and thanks very much. That's very interesting. I'm repeating that, but it indeed was very interesting for me, at least, and I hope for the colleagues as well. So thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for coming to our seminar.
Great. Thanks again for having me, Maxim.
Yeah. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.